right. Hey, everybody. We're now 5 weeks into the course, and we have reached what is probably the single most intimidating topic for most students and instructors in a theory course. We're going to talk a little bit about deconstruction. So, deconstruction is a philosophy, or really more kind of an anti-philosophy, that develops in the mid-20th century, but that has roots in the 19th and early 20th centuries, and is indeed it's kind of like the next step in like beyond structuralism. A lot of the big deconstructionist thinkers get their start as structuralists. They're coming from a similar theoretical basis. And in fact, the terms deconstruction and post-structuralism are often used kind of interchangeably. At least in the United States. Not all post-structuralists are deconstructionists, though. So the way we know we're dealing with deconstruction is if we're dealing with a thinker who is focused pretty much exclusively on language, right? So deconstruction always really, in a lot of ways, comes down to language. So there are a couple of things I asked you to read today. I asked you to read some excerpts from Friedrich Nietzsche's Will to Power. Nietzsche is not a deconstructionist, but there would be no deconstruction without Nietzsche. I also asked you to read Jacques Derrida's essay on difference and Roland Barthes' essays on the death of the author and from work to text. All right. So, what is deconstruction and what does it do? So what a deconstructionist does, essentially, is take the basic premises of structuralism, right, this notion about how language is ordered, and submits them to rigorous questioning, right? So Saussure says that linguistic meanings are based on difference, right? We know we're dealing with the sign cat, because it's not bat or hat or rat or that, right? We define signs based in large part on their difference from each other. So for a deconstructionist, what this means is that, well, language doesn't really mean anything inherently, right? There is no sign that means anything on its own. So this makes language insufficient grounds for establishing coherence or unity in a text. So you might remember, the new critics were fixated on this idea of organic unity, right? This notion that the text resolved all of its ambiguous meanings and paradoxes in a kind of harmonious whole, right? What deconstructionists do, right? They're actually looking for places where unity falls apart in the text, right? So they're looking for that one thread that you can pull to make the whole thing fall apart. Essentially what they're doing is demonstrating the way texts resist any kind of coherent structure. All right, so where does this come from? There are three main sources apart from Saussure, right? So there's the philosophy of Friedrich Nietzsche. We'll talk about in more detail in a minute. There is the phenomenology of Edmund Husserl and Martin Heidegger, which we talked a little bit about last week. And also, what we haven't talked about yet, and probably won't for another couple of weeks, is Freudian psychoanalysis. So it's really kind of bringing these three influences to bear on Saussure's theory of language. So the important texts in this school of criticism. The basis is anything written by Nietzsche. Right? That's kind of where all of this line of thinking gets started, even kind of before Saussure. Deconstruction as a practice really takes off, particularly in France, and then later on in North America, in the 1960s. So probably the first important deconstructionist book is Jacques Derrida's Of Grammatology, and Writing in Difference, which is published in the same year. We'll talk today about what difference means exactly. Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari's Anti-Oedipus, published 1972. Roland Barthes' The Pleasure of the Text, published 1973. You may remember Barthes from a couple weeks ago. We talked about his book Mythologies as a key example of structuralist criticism. Barthes is one of those figures who started his career as a structuralist and gradually, under the influence of Derrida, becomes a deconstructionist. Probably the most important and influential deconstructionist working in the United States was the Belgian critic Paul de Man, whose Allegories of Reading, published in 1979, and Resistance to Theory, published in 1986, are still key texts, even as de Man himself is now under something of a kind of personal cloud due to things discovered about him after his death in the early 80s. And Barbara Johnson's The Critical Difference, published in 1989, is a really good U.S. example of deconstructionist criticism. All right, so where does this all start? With Friedrich Nietzsche. So Nietzsche is a German philosopher whose training was not in philosophy, but actually in classics. He began his career as a classics scholar. So a lot of his thinking is based on his examinations of ancient Greek culture and literature. So because this is stuff with which he's intimately familiar, he uses it to question the premises of Western philosophy since Plato. So he sees Plato and Socrates as kind of like the origin point of Western philosophy. And what he's trying to do from beneath this fabulous 19th century mustache is pick apart the tradition that begins with these figures. So one thing he argues for is what he calls master-slave morality. Now, what this really means is that morality is relative and it's context-dependent, right? It's conditioned by the society in which a person is raised. So, for example, in ancient Rome, things like pride and ambition were regarded as virtues, whereas meekness, mercy, humility were regarded as vices, right? They showed that you were not a person to be trusted or respected. Now, what Christianity does, as it takes over the Roman Empire, is reverse this polarity. So it used to be a morality that was associated with the slave class, meekness, obedience, purity, mercy, things of that nature, becomes associated with the dominant class, with elites, right? While the things that the previous elite culture valued become vices. So this is what we mean when we talk about master-slave morality, this context-dependent nature of moral behavior and ethics. He also argues, much like later deconstructionists will, that the world is empty of inherent meaning, right? The world as it is given to us does not mean anything on its own. Right? There is no secret of life. We assign meanings to various words, symbols, objects, experiences based on our own sense impressions, our own kind of like life worlds, right? But this doesn't mean that there's any meaning inherent in the thing itself, right? So we try to assert authority over our surroundings by assigning meaning to our experiences. even though outside of our own lives, they're actually entities altogether. So he proposes a thought experiment. Nietzsche asks you to imagine that you are falling down a bottomless pit. You're always going to be falling at the same rate, right? You're never going to speed up or slow down, and you're never going to hit bottom. On top of this, a little demon appears on your shoulder and continually whispers in your ear, hey, it never gets better. It never gets better. Psst, just want to remind you, it never gets better. So Nietzsche judges what kind of person you are, whether you are possessed of philosophical courage, based on how you respond to this situation. If you respond, as most people probably would, with a great deal of fear, anxiety, and panic, right? Then you would argue that you are hung up with Angst. Right? Angst is a German word that means fear or anxiety, and for Nietzsche, it specifically refers to that panicked response to figuring out that nothing has any meaning, right? That the universe is inherently meaningless. Whereas philosophical courage is demonstrated through bold acceptance of this fact. So, okay, if I'm going to be falling forever, nothing is ever going to catch me, this is never going to stop, my lot is never going to improve, then how I accommodate myself to this, right? How I accommodate myself to a world which lacks meaning or safety is how I demonstrate courage. So Derrida, seen here in profile, smoking a pipe. So you can tell Derrida is a French intellectual because of the fabulous head of white hair. He's a French philosopher and literary critic, born 1930 in Algeria. And he is the first major deconstructionist thinker to whom that label adheres. Right? There are others who thought along similar lines prior to Derrida, but we don't associate the label deconstructionist as closely with it. So he follows Nietzsche in questioning the Western philosophical tradition, though Derrida is specifically concerned with the way notions of philosophical truth are encoded in the language. And a lot of what he's involved with, what his work is involved with, is that kind of rethinking of Saussurian linguistics that I introduced to you at the beginning of this lecture. So one of Derrida's key ideas is the idea of logocentrism. Right? So basically he argues that Western philosophy is logocentric. Logos, for Derrida, means word plus reason. So logos is a Greek word that simply means word. The Greek word for word. But in Derrida's philosophy, the logos is something that is in and of itself a sufficient ground or foundation for meaning. Right? So logos is Derrida's word for meaning, inherent meaning that is grounded in language. Right? He also argues that the Western philosophical tradition has privileged speech over writing, because the presence of the speaker is somehow a guarantor of meaning. Right? The fact the speaker is there and present, and you can read the speaker's body language, or you can question the speaker about his or her meaning, right? This means that speech is more reliable as a form of communication than writing. Not in Derrida's formulation, right? But in the history history of Western philosophy. So Western philosophers intended to use speech as the model for analyzing all discourse, not writing. But Derrida argues that grounding meaning in logos is a fool's errand. It's always going to fail. And this is because the speaker does not ultimately have control over what their utterance means to the listener. We might think back to Wimsatt and Beardsley and that idea of the intentional fallacy. So Wimsatt and Beardsley argued that the writer, the author, has no control really over the interpretation of the work once it's released out into the world. Or at the very least, that the author's intentions for the work should not necessarily condition our reception of it. What Derrida is arguing, and I've experienced this in classes myself, is the speaker's lack of control over his or her own meaning. Right? That I can try to make this as clear as possible for you, but I can't guarantee that you are going to take from the speech that I am uttering now, that you are going to understand what I want you to understand. So, Derrida actually argues that writing should be privileged over speech. Because what is etched onto the page, right, while it may be further removed from original meaning than spoken text, right, we can catch nuances on the page that we might not catch in speech. So he gives, for example, here, his own coinage différence. So, différence, spelled with an E, is a real French word that means difference. Différence, pronounced exactly the same way but with an A, is Derrida's own unique coinage, in which he combines the words for to differ and to defer. You can only tell which is meant in writing because the two sound the same. Therefore, speech cannot be superior to writing. So, what does this mean to differ and to defer, right? So, the part about differing is derived directly from Saussure's science system. Right? So, Saussure describes language as determining meaning through difference between signs. However, Derrida also argues that because the sign is merely a metaphorical presence, right? It's merely a symbol for some signified object or concept, it's also always a step removed from the object it describes, the signified it describes. So language also constantly defers meaning. So meaning never comes to rest in any kind of real presence in language. So language, by its very nature, infinitely defers meaning. Does your head hurt yet? It will. But at the same time, our thought is necessarily inscribed in language. It's the only means we have for reliably communicating our thoughts to each other. But because all language is inherently metaphorical, as I said, and it's full of irreconcilable paradoxes, undecidable reference, and words with multiple meanings. So multiple meaning, the word that Derrida uses for this is polyphony. Not only can we not escape from language, language to mean anything. Because there is no coherent, rational grounds in language for establishing meaning. So, I mentioned Roland Barthes a few slides ago. And Barthes was a French philosopher, semiotician, and former structuralist. And Barthes is taking a lot of Derrida's ideas, and in many ways applying them more specifically to literary texts than Derrida did. So Derrida is interested in literature, but he is more interested in language and the way language functions, right? So Barthes is exploring the implications of Derrida's ideas for literature. So one of the key concepts with which Barthes is associated is this idea of the death of the author, which is taking the intentional fallacy a few steps further. So Wimsatt and Beardsley just said that the author's intentions shouldn't matter more than the reader's experience, right, in interpreting a work. But Barthes, following on from structuralist treatments of the author as a mere arranger of convention and codes, says that in fact, the very idea of the author is a product of Enlightenment individualism and capitalist hegemony, right? So we don't really have even an idea of an author as this kind of powerful individual creative force until the 18th century. And it's really kind of like an attempt on the part of these individualist philosophies to assert a kind of control or hegemony over the text, its interpretation perception. So for Barthes, deferring to the author of a text shuts down the play of codes and possible meanings inherent in any given text, right? And it shifts the locus of power and authority over the meaning to the writer, right? What Barthes wants to do by killing the author is shifting that locus of power and authority to the reader, right? It's the way the reader experiences the work that matters. It's the way the reader takes these codes and conventions and finds the pressure points and gaps in the text that's really important, not the work the author has done in arranging the text. Barthes actually, we see he lived a relatively long and full life, but his death in 1980 was untimely in that he was killed when he was hit by a bus when he was crossing the street. So I note that because that is a rather unusual way for a literary critic to die. So I think we got here a humorous illustration here of the death of the author in a much more literal form. But I think it's also worth spending a little bit of time with Barthes' distinction between work and text, right? So what he wants to do here is reorient the way critics think about the objects that they interpret, right? So the traditional way of thinking, he says, is by thinking of a literary work, right? Like a work of art, a work of genius. The word work for Barthes describes a singular artistic production created by an author, anchored in the past, and it refers to an object, not to an experience or a methodology. Right? So the work is itself this object from the past, created by an author that has this aura of authority. Right? And it's always limited to a signify. It's the work, the word work in this context for art is not a complete sign. It's just a thing that is signified by a title. Now, text, on the other hand, is plural for Barth rather than singular. Right? The word text refers to all things that can be read or experienced, and indeed exists only as language, and only when being read or experienced. Right? So it doesn't refer to anything that no one is currently reading or experiencing. It is a complete sign, a signifier, and a signified. And it can't, because there's no authorial control over the text, right? It's more a thing you're doing as you read than a thing that you read, if that makes sense. It can't be limited to any single definitive meaning, right? This is key for understanding Barth and key for understanding deconstruction generally, right? There is no single meaningful takeaway that we're going to get from any text that we read. Right? What's interesting about a text is the undecidability of meaning, right? The way different codes and conventions encoded in language play off of each other and put off all of our attempts to assign meaning to. Two other terms from Barth that you should know are leasable or readerly writing and scriptable or writerly writing. These are both neologisms. He makes these words up based on the French words for reading and writing. So leasable writing is oriented towards the reader. Right? It's writing that has a straightforward structure and narration. There is very little work required from the reader to comprehend it, and characters, motivations, and actions are plausible and understandable. So like your average 19th century realist novel, something like George Eliot, Anthony Trollope, Charles Dickens, Elizabeth Gaskell, right? What is essentially readerly prose. It's designed to be easily comprehended and to kind of resemble real experience in the real world. Now, what Barth prefers, when he regards as the superior form of writing, is what he calls scriptable or writerly writing. So this is oriented towards the writer, with very few nods made towards the reader or towards accessibility. It's self-consciously literary, right? It tends to be experimental. Anything that you can label kind of avant-garde or experimental would probably fall under this category. And what's important or interesting for Barth about the scriptable text is that it's defined by a sense of play with language, right? The plot's not important, the characters aren't important, themes, whatever, are not important. What's important is the play of language. Now, the last important concept from Barth that you should be aware of comes from his 1973 book, The Pleasure of the Text, Jouissance. So jouissance literally translates from French to enjoyment, but it's a particular kind of enjoyment. Jouissance is also a euphemism for orgasm. And he compares it to the more pedestrian pleasure he calls plaisir. Right? So plaisir is simple enjoyment of a text, right, that doesn't challenge or redefine you in any significant way. So when you're reading a leasable or readerly text, right, you sit down and you enjoy the character and enjoy the plots and you're entertained. So that kind of reading experience, Barthes defines as plaisir, right? Enjoyable, but not life-changing, world-shattering, or ecstatic, right? Whereas jouissance is an ecstatic experience that occurs while you're reading. Right? That the reading of the text breaks apart familiar codes and conventions and redefines your position as a reader in relation to the text and to the world, right? So this is why he compares this kind of reading, this kind of pleasure in reading, to orgasm. It's a much more intense form of pleasure, right? Something that is much more powerful than simple enjoyment. It engages your whole body and brain. And jouissance for bards is primarily experienced when you're reading a scrutable or writerly text that frankly demands more of you. Okay, so last figure I want us to talk about here today is the Belgian-American literary theorist Paul Deman. So Deman is an interesting kind of success story on one level. He comes to the United States in the 1940s and becomes an important and influential academic without really much formal academic education or training. He shows up in the U.S. without having completed any degrees, and manages to insinuate himself into first departments of French and then departments of comparative literature. He becomes the chair of the Department of Comparative Literature at Yale by the end of his career. And he's the primary exponent of deconstructionist theory in the 70s and 80s in the United States. So the two big ideas that Deman focuses his work on, right, are also we can kind of see drawn from structuralism and are very similar to many of the kind of binary distinctions around which Derrida's work and Barthes's work are organized. Right? Anybody who's influenced by structuralism tends to love binary oppositions. So the first key binary opposition we see in Deman is between grammar and rhetoric. So grammar refers to the code and the rules of language. Right? How can I make an utterance that other speakers of my language will comprehend? Rhetoric refers instead to the play of figures and tropes. Right? He's very big into figures of speech. Right? Remember that Derrida said that all language is essentially figurative. All language is essentially metaphorical. Deman takes this idea and really runs with it. He argues that this is because like these superior forms of language are those which we use really to engage in play rather than simply to communicate. And kind of connected to this, he draws from J.L. Austin's speech act theory, these terms constative and performative. So constative utterances for Deman are related to grammar, right? These are utterances that assert something factual and that can be judged true or false, right? Things that you could look up and say this is true or this is false. Whereas performative language refers to utterances that do something. Questioning, praising, promising, reading, initiating, christening, anything that performative utterances change the world in some way, perform some kind of action. And this he relates to rhetoric, right? It's doing things with language, not just asserting things. All literary texts for Deman are performative and allegorical. Essentially, they say one thing on the concept level, and they perform something else. you supposed to do with all of this? How do you perform a deconstructionist reading of a text? Well, here are three ways you can go about this, right? One is to try to do what deconstructionists call exploding binaries. So first, what you want to do is look for binary oppositions in the text. Heat, cold, male, female, sun, moon, light, dark, right? Paired opposites. The way the binaries are expressed usually presents an unspoken hierarchy, right? The first term in the binary, whichever one we tend to think of first or write first, is usually the one that is, for whatever reason, preferred, right? It is regarded as better. So, what you do is subvert the hierarchy by making the secondary term primary. It's like, okay, what if we take this binary and we favor dark over light, right? How does that then change the way we read this? But then, because meaning is always ultimately undecidable, you repeat the process and you show, well, actually, because we can also read this binary or this text with light as the favored element. The binary itself is false and undecidable. Ergo, meaningless. The second thing you can do, you can start by looking for rhetorical figures, metaphor, synecdoche, metonymy, hyperbole, whatever, any rhetorical figures you can think of, and point out ways in which apparently literal language is really just a figure of speech, right? Things that we tend to think of as literal are often actually metaphorical. So, for example, when I talk about the leg of a table, right, the thing that holds a table up, well, why do I call that thing a leg? Well, it's an analogy to my own leg, right, to the human leg that holds up a body. And yet leg itself, the word, is metaphorical in that it represents this thing that exists in the world, right? It's a mere representation, it's not the thing itself. So if you can point out ways in which something apparently literal is actually just a figure of speech, then you're doing deconstruction. Probably one of the most useful ways you can approach this is to do what's called double reading. So it's called double reading because it involves reading through a text at least twice, right? Your first reading, the leasable reading, that is the reader intelligible reading, is going to kind of pull out the obvious meaning, right? Okay, this is the obvious literal meaning of this text. You're then going to do a second critical reading that breaks the text up into what a deconstructionist calls aporia. So aporia refers to a deadlock of equally valid but incompatible meanings. So you're looking for other things the text can mean apart from this literal or obvious meaning. You're trying to pull out as many of these as you can and then show the ways in which they are in fact not compatible with each other, right? This is in a lot of ways the opposite of what the new critics do. The new critics are concerned with showing that all of the possible readings of a text, or they wouldn't really use the word text, they'd say of a work, right, are in fact compatible with each other. A deconstructionist is more concerned with demonstrating that no, actually these readings are not compatible. They may be equally valid and equally true, but they can't simply coexist peacefully side by side. Right? We can't reconcile these meanings with each other. So deconstruction has a little bit of a dodgy reputation. a lot of thinkers and critics and members of the general public are skeptical of a philosophical position that asserts that it's impossible to accurately express meaning. Usually, when people talk about these so-called theory wars in universities in the 1990s, and when people talk about opposition to theory, theory is basically a synonym for deconstruction. Right? That's what they're thinking of. Deconstruction and other post-structuralist theories that kind of took over certain segments of the American academy in the 80s and 90s. So, bear that in mind as you're experimenting with this stuff. Like, think about why some people might be uncomfortable with this, or what kind of the logical conclusions it brings you to that might also not sit well with them. But also just try to have fun with it. Like, once you understand what you're doing with deconstruction, it is a hell of a lot of fun to do. Right? It's not. I will say it's not the mode that I usually work in when I'm doing my own stuff, but just sitting down and deconstructing, it can be a useful exercise because it can be helpful to put different incompatible meanings of the text side by side. But it's also just it's fun, right? It's actually kind of enjoyable. And when Roland Barthes talks about the pleasure of doing this kind of reading, right? He's not lying. He's not exaggerating. This feels good. It's fun. It's a good time. Give it a shot. So we'll see you on the discussion boards. I'm sure you are probably going to have some questions about this because, as I said, right, at the beginning of the lecture, this is one of the units in a theory class that a lot of instructors really dread teaching because it is hard. It is hard to explain in a way that makes sense. Some of that is due to bad translations from the French, or terms that don't really translate easily from English into French. Right? You may have noticed that deconstructionists like to make up words because, again, these are people who don't necessarily feel that language is something kind of sacred or sacrosanct that needs to be respected. Right? Language is play with signifiers. So making up neologisms is totally cool. Some of the concepts often maybe seem a little bit vague and fuzzy. Right? Less so once you start figuring them out and working with them. But yeah, please do post any questions you have to the discussion board. I'm happy to answer anything I can for you. And yeah, we'll see